The vibration in the floorboards was wrong. It was not the rhythmic, deep chest thrum of the main leg lifting 3,000 bushels of hard red winter wheat per hour. It was a high-frequency chatter, a metallic teeth grinding that traveled up through the concrete spine of the elevator and into the soles of my Red Wing boots. I stood 180 feet above the Kansas prairie, inside the head house of the Tri-County Cooperative. To the uninitiated, a grain elevator is just a tall concrete cylinder on the horizon. To a millwright, it is a vertical factory of moving belts, gravity spouts, and explosive dust. I was the surgeon for this dying beast, and right now, the patient was screaming. I wiped a smear of grease from my safety glasses with a rag that was already black with molybdenum disulfide. The distributor head, the massive, rotating steel drum that directed grain from the main vertical leg into the 12 different storage silos beneath me, was jamming. Again. "Lock it out," I said to the empty room. The protocol was muscle memory. I walked to the Motor Control Center, MCC, on the west wall. The gray panels were coated in a fine layer of beige dust, the omnipresent skin of the harvest. I threw the disconnect lever for the distributor motor, listening for the heavy thunk of the contacts opening. I fished my padlock from my coverall pocket, the brass cold against my thumb, and shackled the lever in the off position.
I pocketed the key. Rule number 1. If you do not control the energy kills you.
The silence that followed was heavy. When the machinery is running, the head house is a deafening acoustic chamber of crashing grain and whining gearboxes. When it stops, you can hear the wind. It whistled through the gaps in the corrugated steel siding, a lonely, hollow sound that reminded you exactly how high up you were. I knelt beside the distributor inspection hatch. The air up here was thin and cold, November biting through the uninsulated metal walls. I pulled my spud wrench from its holster, a heavy 18-inch tool with a tapered spike handle for aligning bolt holes. I fit the jaw over the rusted nut securing the hatch. It fought me. I leaned my weight into it, feeling the torque in my shoulder, until the rust bond shattered with a sharp crack. I removed the plate. Inside, the steel inner spout was misaligned, grinding against the housing. A bearing failure in the lower pillow block. I sighed, the breath pluming white in the dim light of the singular sodium vapor bulb hanging above. This was not a 5-minute fix. This was a chain fall and torch job. I stood up to stretch my back. My knees popped, a sound distinct from the settling concrete. I was 42, but 20 years of climbing ladders and hauling chain on concrete floors made me feel 60. I walked to the dirty plexiglass window that looked south toward the interstate.
Usually, this was my moment of zen. The view from the top of the elevator commanded 30 miles of flat, brown earth, bisected by the gray ribbon of I-70. Today, the ribbon was broken. I squinted. The glass was caked in grime on the outside, but the shapes were unmistakable. Traffic was not just backed up. It was stopped dead. A solid line of gleaming metal stretching from the western horizon to the east. But it was the smoke that held my eye. 3 distinct pillars of black, oily smoke were rising from the highway, spaced maybe a mile apart. I pulled a rag and rubbed a clear circle on the inside of the glass, pressing my face against the cold surface. Movement. Erratic, insect-like movement. On the frontage road that ran parallel to the highway, usually empty except for the occasional farm truck, cars were driving through the ditch, tearing up the dormant switchgrass. I watched a white SUV clip the drainage culvert, launch airborne for a fraction of a second, and roll violently into the field. It settled on its roof, wheels spinning. Nobody got out. I waited. In a normal world, other cars would stop. Brake lights would flare. Samaritans would run across the field. Instead, the cars behind the wreck swerved around it without slowing down. They drove through the debris field, bouncing over the detached bumper, desperate to keep moving. "What in the hell?" I muttered. I pulled my phone from my breast pocket. No signal.
Not just 0 bars, but the SOS icon that meant the towers were dead or refusing the handshake. I checked the time. 14:40. The shift was supposed to end at 5. I looked down. Directly below me, at the base of the concrete silos, lay the scale house and the gravel lot where the semi-trucks lined up to dump their loads. It was quiet down there. My pickup, a beat-up Silverado with a welding rig in the bed, sat alone near the maintenance shed. Then the door to the scale house flew open. Jim, the weighmaster, stumbled out. He was a big man, heavy-set, usually slow-moving. He was sprinting. He did not run toward his truck. He ran toward the rail siding, toward the open prairie. Behind him, a second figure emerged. I had no binoculars, but the angle was steep, almost vertical. The second figure did not run like Jim. It moved with a jerky, predatory mechanical gait. It tackled Jim just as he reached the gravel ballast of the train tracks. They went down in a tangle of limbs. I watched, detached by distance and altitude. It looked like a bar fight. Then I saw the red spray against the white limestone gravel. It was bright, arterial red, visible even from 180 feet up. The second figure did not punch. It buried its face in Jim's neck and thrashed like a dog shaking a rat. I stepped back from the window, my heart hammering a sudden, irregular rhythm against my ribs. My brain tried to process the geometry of what I'd just seen. An assault? A murder? I looked back at the highway. The smoke columns were growing. The chaos was not an isolated incident at the scale house. It was fractal, repeating at every scale I could see. I looked at the steel trapdoor in the floor, the only way into the head house. The elevator was essentially a hollow fortress. To get to me, you had to enter the ground floor boot pit, climb a tight, caged ladder for 20 feet, transition to the man lift, a terrifying continuous rubber belt with small footsteps and handholds that carried you up through a narrow shaft in the concrete, and then exit onto the distributor floor. I was safe. Physics was on my side. Gravity was the best security guard in the world, provided you controlled the vertical access. But the man lift was still powered. If I could ride it up, something else could ride it up. The panic flared, hot and chemical, urging me to run. Run where? Down the ladder? Into the parking lot where Jim was currently being disassembled? To the highway that looked like a war zone? I took a breath, holding it for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4. The panic was just a vibration, like the chatter in the distributor. You do not scream at the machine. You isolate the fault. "Secure the perimeter," I whispered. I turned back to the motor control center. My hands were shaking slightly, making the keys on my ring jingle. I forced them to stop. I found the breaker labeled Humphrey Man Lift. I threw it. The low hum of the belt drive in the adjacent room died. The lift was dead. But dead was not disabled. A breaker could be flipped back on. If someone or something wandered into the electrical room at the base, they could restart it. Or, if they were determined, they could climb the emergency ladder that ran parallel to the belt. A 180-foot vertical climb in a pitch-black tube. Unlikely for a confused rioter, impossible for an animal. But I was not betting my life on unlikely. I needed to seal the hatch.
I walked to the floor opening. It was a rectangle, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, covered by a heavy steel grate that was currently hinged open. The man-lift belt hung motionless in the center, disappearing into the dark abyss of the shaft. The smell of old grain dust and subterranean dampness drifted up from below. I kicked the grate down. It slammed shut with a clang that rang like a gong. It was not enough. The grate had no lock. It was just gravity held. I looked around the head house. It was a machinery space, not a warehouse. There were spare electric motors, spools of wire, buckets of grease, and a pile of scrap steel. I spotted a stack of replacement liner plates for the grain spouts. These were slabs of AR-400, abrasion-resistant steel, half an inch thick and weighing about 60 pounds each. I grabbed the first one.
It was slick with oil residue. I hauled it over to the hatch, grunting as I dropped it across the grate. It covered about a third of the mesh. I went back for another, and another. By the time I was done, 300 pounds of hardened steel plate sat on top of the trap door. I stood over it, sweat cooling rapidly on my forehead in the drafty room. Nothing was pushing that up from underneath without a hydraulic ram. I checked the second entrance, the exterior fire escape. It was a terrifying galvanized steel staircase bolted to the outside of the silos, exposed to the wind. The door at the top was a standard industrial fire door with a crash bar on the inside. I walked over to it and pressed my hip against the bar, cracking it open just an inch to check the latch. The wind ripped the door from my hand, slamming it against the exterior railing. I wrestled it back shut, my heart jumping. The latch mechanism was cheap. A determined shoulder could pop it. I looked at my tool bag. I had an impact driver and a box of self-tapping Tex screws, the kind used for metal roofing. I pulled the drill. I drove 6 screws through the door frame and into the door itself, sewing the steel jamb to the steel skin of the door. Zip, thunk. Zip, thunk. The sound was comforting. It was the sound of construction, the sound of permanence. I stepped back. The head house was now a sealed box. I was trapped. Or they were locked down. Perspective mattered. I walked back to the window. The sun was dipping low in the west, painting the smoke plumes a bruised purple. The fire on the highway had spread. I could see flickering orange light reflecting off the chrome of the gridlocked semi-trucks. My stomach growled. A mundane, biological intrusion into the apocalypse. I checked the break room, a plywood shack built in the corner of the distributor floor to keep the dust off the paperwork. Inside was a scarred laminate table, a microwave that looked like it predated the internet, and a mini-fridge. I opened the fridge. 2 bottles of water, a Tupperware container with leftover spaghetti, mine, a jar of jalapenos, a half-empty energy drink. I checked the cupboards. A box of sugar cubes, a canister of Folgers coffee, a sleeve of Ritz crackers that felt soft and stale when I squeezed them. Not enough. Not nearly enough. I sat on the folding metal chair. The reality of the height began to settle in. I was isolated. That was good. But I was separated from resources. That was bad. The elevator was designed to move grain, not support life. There was no running water up here. The bathroom was at the base, next to the scale house where Jim had died. There was no heat. The head house was uninsulated sheet metal over a steel frame. When the sun went down, this room would become a freezer. I looked at the spaghetti. I did not eat it. I put the lid back on and placed it back in the fridge. Rationing started now. I needed to take stock of my assets. I emptied my pockets onto the table. A folding Kershaw knife,
A classic Zippo lighter, fluid level unknown. A ring of keys, master keys for the facility, Lotto keys, truck keys. A Sharpie marker. A small LED streamlight flashlight. My wallet. I dumped the tool bag next. Milwaukee M18 impact driver, battery 2 bars. Spud wrench. Set of metric and SAE wrenches. Channel lock pliers. Wire strippers. Multimeter. Roll of electrical tape, black. A handful of wire nuts. A partial box of tech screws. It was a pathetic arsenal for the end of the world. It was a magnificent kit for fixing a limit switch. I had to stop thinking like a survivor and start thinking like a millwright. The wind picked up as the light failed. The metal siding began to rattle, a chaotic percussion that would mask the sound of anyone approaching. I hated that. I needed to hear. I walked out to the main floor. The shadows were lengthening, stretching across the concrete floor like black fingers. The distributor had loomed in the center, a silent steel monolith. I needed warmth. The motors. The electric motors up here were massive, 75 horsepower beasts that drove the belts. They had thermal mass, but they were cold now. There was a transformer in the electrical room, a step-down transformer that converted the 480-volt industrial power to 120-volt for the lights and outlets.
Transformers generate heat when they run. I walked into the electrical room. It was smaller, enclosed in cinder block to protect the gear from dust. It was noticeably warmer than the main floor, maybe 10 degrees warmer. I placed my hand on the gray metal housing of the lighting transformer. It was humming, vibrating softly under my palm. It was warm, not hot, but warm, like a living thing. Okay, I whispered. This is base camp. I dragged the folding chair from the brake shack into the electrical room. I grabbed the Ritz crackers and the water. I shut the heavy steel fire door of the electrical room. It latched with a solid click. I sat in the dark, illuminated only by the tiny green and red LEDs of the motor controllers. The hum was steady, 60 hertz, the heartbeat of the grid. As long as that hum continued, I was connected to civilization. If that hum stopped, I closed my eyes, but the image of Jim on the white gravel burned behind my eyelids. The way his body had gone slack, the mechanics of it, the structural failure of a human being. I was not a soldier. I was not a prepper. I fixed things that spun. I stood up and took the Sharpie from the table. On the cinder block wall of the electrical room, I wrote the date, November 14th. Underneath it, I wrote, Inventory. Considerations. 2 water, 1 pasta. No exit. I sat back down and listened to the wind howling around the concrete silo. 300 miles from the nearest ocean, stranded on a desert island of stone. I was not going down. Not yet. The problem with the world down there was chaos. The variable count was too high. Up here, the variables were limited. Cold, thirst, gravity. I could solve for those. I leaned my head against the warm metal of the transformer cabinet and waited for the night to freeze the world solid. Morning broke not with light, but with a temperature drop that cracked my lips. I woke up stiff, curled in a fetal ball on the concrete floor of the electrical room, pressed against the base of the transformer cabinet. The metal box was still humming, still warm, but the heat dissipated 6 inches from the casing. My breath hung in the air, a thick fog illuminated by the single pilot light on the breaker panel. I checked my watch. 7:15. I stood up, my joints protesting with audible clicks. The first priority was a sensory check. I opened the door to the main headhouse floor.
The cold hit me like a physical blow. The wind had shifted to the north overnight, driving through the unsealed laps of the corrugated siding. Snow. A fine, dry powder was drifting in through the gaps, dusting the grease-stained concrete like powdered sugar on a dirty brownie. I walked to the south window. The fires on the highway had burned themselves out, leaving blackened scars on the asphalt.
The gridlock remained, a frozen river of steel. The silence was absolute. No sirens, no horns. Just the wind whistling through the elevator's superstructure. I looked down at the scale house. Jim's body was gone. A dark stain remained on the white gravel, but the body was missing. Dragged? Or did he get up? The thought made my skin crawl under my Carhartt coveralls. I turned away from the window. Staring at the problem would not fix it. I had a more immediate failure mode. Dehydration. I had 1.5 bottles of water left. In this dry, freezing air, I would lose moisture just by breathing. I had maybe 24 hours of combat effectiveness before the headache started, 48 before decision-making degraded. I needed a collection system. I looked up at the roof of the head house. It was a pitched steel roof, corrugated metal. There were no gutters. The snow and rain just sheeted off and fell 180 feet to the ground. However, the elevator had a dust collection system, a massive network of galvanized ductwork that sucked grain dust from the conveyor transfer points and piped it to a cyclone filter outside. The ductwork ran along the ceiling. I traced the lines with my eyes. There was a 12-inch diameter pipe that punched through the roof to a vent cap. If I could tap into the roof drainage. No, that was impossible. I could not go out on the roof. The pitch was too steep, and the wind would blow me off. I looked at the snow drifting in through the siding. It was not much, maybe a cup an hour accumulating on the floor. But it was raw material. I needed a melter, and I needed a filter. I walked back to the brake shack. I grabbed the empty Tupperware container and the empty energy drink can. I needed heat. The transformer was warm, but not hot enough to melt snow efficiently, and certainly not hot enough to boil it. I could not build a fire. The dust in this room was a fuel air bomb waiting for a match. The minimum explosive concentration, MEC, for wheat dust is around 50 grams per cubic meter. It was not that dusty right now, but a localized fire could kick up dust and trigger a secondary explosion that would turn this head house into a rocket nozzle. I needed flameless heat. I looked at the halogen work light clamped to the handrail near the distributor. It was a heavy-duty 500-watt quartz halogen fixture. Those things got hot enough to fry an egg on the glass. I unplugged it and carried it into the electrical room. This was my clean zone, dust-free. I set the light on the floor, pointing straight up. I plugged it in. The filament blazed to life, a blinding white star in the dim room. Within seconds, I could feel the radiant heat on my face. Now, the vessel. Plastic Tupperware would melt. The aluminum can was flimsy, but it was metal. I took my Kershaw knife and carefully cut the top off the energy drink can. I bent the jagged edge down with my pliers to create a smooth rim. I went out to the main floor with the Tupperware container. I scraped up the snow drifts that had formed near the north wall. It was mixed with a little grime, but it was white. I packed the container full. Back in the electrical room, I set the aluminum can directly on the glass face of the halogen light. It sat there, precarious. I scooped a handful of snow into the can. I waited. Physics took over. The halogen bulb surface temperature exceeded 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The aluminum transferred the heat. In 30 seconds, the snow slumped. In a minute, I had a half inch of water sizzling at the bottom.
I added more snow. It was slow, agonizingly slow. But it was a process. While the water melted, I thought about filtration. The snow was relatively clean, but it had blown through the industrial siding. It contained dust, bird droppings, mouse urine, the biological detritus of the elevator. Boiling would kill the bacteria, but it would not remove the particulates. I needed a filter stack. I looked at my face mask, the N95 respirator hanging around my neck. It was designed to filter particulates down to 3 microns. I took the second empty water bottle. I used my knife to cut the bottom off. I inverted it, creating a funnel. I took the N95 mask and cut a circle out of the filter media.
I stuffed it into the neck of the inverted bottle, pushing it down tight against the cap opening. I needed a secondary stage. Charcoal. Activated charcoal absorbs toxins. I did not have activated charcoal. I looked at the piece of burnt toast in the break room trash can. No. I looked at the electrical panel. Carbon brushes. The DC motors on the old Tripper car used carbon brushes. I knew there was a spare set in the parts locker. I rummaged through the steel cabinet until I found the box. Baldor carbon brush set. Blocks of compressed graphite and carbon. I took a hammer from my bag and smashed the carbon blocks into a coarse powder on the concrete floor. It was not medical-grade activated charcoal, but carbon is carbon. It would trap some chemical impurities. I poured the crushed carbon on top of the N95 fabric in my funnel. Now I had a system. Step 1. Collection. Scrape snow from the lee side of the distributor. Step 2. Liquefaction and pasteurization. Melt and boil the water in the aluminum can atop the 500-watt halogen lamp. Step 3. Filtration. Pour the hot water through the carbon N95 stack into the clean reservoir. I watched the can on the light. The water began to bubble. A rolling boil. Kill you bastards, I thought, imagining the Giardia cysts exploding. I let it boil for a full minute, counting the seconds out loud. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. I poured the steaming, slightly gray water into my filter funnel. It trickled through the carbon, through the mask fabric, and dripped into the Tupperware container below. The water that came out was clear. I lifted the container and took a sip. It tasted like metallic ozone and flat plastic. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I spent the next 4 hours tending my water farm. Scrape, melt, boil, filter. It was tedious, repetitive labor. It was exactly the kind of work I understood. By noon, I had filled both water bottles and the Tupperware, nearly 2 liters of potable water. But the cold was winning. The electrical room was losing heat faster than the transformer could generate it. The wind was stripping the warmth away through the cinder blocks. I needed insulation. The headhouse did not have pink fiberglass rolls lying around. It had steel, rubber, and grain. Grain. Grain is an insulator. That's why grain fires are so dangerous. They smolder deep inside the pile, insulated by the surrounding wheat, holding heat for weeks. I opened the hatch to the distributor spout number 4. This spout led to a silo that I knew was full. The bin chart on the wall said Silo 4 was topped off with hard red winter wheat just yesterday. I looked down the spout. The grain was right there, backed up to the distributor. If I could bring the grain up. I did not have a shovel. I had a hard hat. I took my hard hat off. I reached into the spout and scooped out a helmet full of wheat. It was heavy, dusty, and smelled like sweet earth. I carried it to the electrical room.
I dumped it on the floor in the corner. I went back. Another scoop. Another. It was back-breaking work. Hundreds of trips. But I had nothing but time. I began to build a nest. I piled the grain against the north wall of the electrical room, the coldest wall. I created a berm of wheat, 2 feet thick, 3 feet high. And then I piled it around the transformer. I was building a thermal battery. I took the empty cardboard boxes from the parts shelf, boxes that had held bearings and bolts, and broke them down. I laid the cardboard on the concrete floor to create a thermal break. Then I poured a layer of wheat over the cardboard. I dragged a heavy canvas tarp from the maintenance pile, used for covering motors during washdowns, and threw it over the wheat pile in the corner. I tested it. I lay down on the tarp. The wheat shifted under me, conforming to my body like a beanbag chair. The cardboard and grain insulated me from the heat-sucking concrete. It was not a feather bed, but for the first time in 20 hours, my shivering stopped. I lay there, listening to the halogen lamp hiss as a drop of water hit the glass. I had water. I had a heat trap. I had a secure perimeter. I looked at the multimeter on the shelf. The red digits on the transformer display read the ambient temp, 52 degrees Fahrenheit.
Before the grain wall, it had been 45 degrees Fahrenheit. 7 degrees of engineering. I closed my eyes. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing. I was surviving the elements, but the elements were static. The variable down below, the biological variable, was dynamic. I needed to know what was happening. I sat up and grabbed the handheld UHF radio from the charging cradle on the wall. This was the house radio, used for talking to the scale house and the rail crew. I turned the volume knob. Static. I scanned the channels. Channel 1, Ops. Static. Channel 2, Maintenance. Static. I hit the scan button. The radio cycled through the frequencies. Crackle. Repeat, do not approach the hospital. The perimeter is compromised. Any units in the vicinity... I froze. A voice. Human. Panicked. Sector 4 is gone. We are pulling back to the rail yard. If anyone is listening, the rail yard is the extraction point. The signal faded into hiss. The rail yard. That was directly below me. I scrambled to the window, abandoning my warm nest. I looked down at the tracks. The siding was empty. But far down the line, to the east, I saw lights. Not car headlights. The blinding white beam of a locomotive. A train was coming. And if the radio was right, it was bringing the chaos with it. I gripped the cold steel of the window frame. My fortress was about to be besieged, and I had just spent all my energy building a bed of wheat. I needed a weapon, and I needed it 10 minutes ago. I looked at the tool bag, a hammer, a screwdriver. No, I needed leverage. I looked at the cheater pipe, a 4-foot length of heavy-gauge steel pipe used to extend the handle of a wrench for breaking seized bolts. It was heavy, brutal, and indestructible. I picked it up. The steel was cold and oily. It felt real. I went back to the trapdoor. The steel plates were still in place. I checked the gap. I was safe. For now. But the locomotive horn blasted, a mournful, terrified sound that cut through the wind. It was close. I stood in the dark, clutching the length of pipe, and watched the beam of the train sweep across the prairie, illuminating the dead tractors and the fleeing shadows. The laws of motion are indifferent to tragedy. Mass times velocity equals momentum.
and the Union Pacific locomotive barreling toward the siding had too much of both. I stood at the south window, my hands pressed against the freezing glass, watching the physics play out with sick fascination. The train was not slowing down. The headlight beam cut a frantic, bouncing arc through the twilight as the engine rocked on the uneven ballast of the spur line. It was a chaotic frequency, left, right, left, that no wheel flange could tolerate for long. The derailment started at the switch point, exactly where the rail split to service the grain load out. The lead locomotive did not turn.
It plowed straight ahead, shearing the steel rail like a bolt cutter snapping a wire. The sound did not reach me for a full second, and when it did, it was not a crash. It was a geological roar. The engine buried its nose in the gravel embankment, the sudden deceleration lifting the 80-ton carriage into the air. Momentum transferred down the line. The boxcars behind it, loaded with who knows what, accordioned. They jackknifed, climbing over one another in a screeching pyramid of steel. Sparks showered the dry prairie grass like a pyrotechnic fountain, instantly igniting the dormant vegetation. Then the lights went out. Not just the train lights, the yard lights, the highway lights in the distance. And, with a heart-stopping clunk, the transformer in the room behind me died. The hum stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against my eardrums. The headhouse plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The halogen lamp, my heat source, my water purifier, faded from a blinding white star to a dull orange filament, then to nothing. "No," I whispered. I fumbled for the streamlight in my pocket, clicking it on. The beam cut a narrow cone through the dusty air. I swung it toward the multimeter on the shelf. The display was blank. The grid was down. The kinetic energy of the crash must have taken out a transmission tower or severed the main feed to the substation. I was blind. I was freezing. And my water production had just hit zero. I moved back to the window. Below, the wreck was illuminated by the growing brush fires. The wreckage had spilled perilously close to the base of the silos. But it was not the twisted metal that made my stomach drop. The cargo was spilling out. The boxcars had not been carrying freight. They had been carrying people. Hundreds of them. They poured out of the ruptured steel containers like water from a broken dam. But they did not move like injured refugees. They did not limp or crawl. They sprinted. They moved with a hive mind fluidity, a black tide reacting to stimulus. And the stimulus was the scale house. I saw the door to the office kick open. The weighmaster's body, or what was left of it, was swarmed instantly. But they did not stop there. They slammed against the base of the silos, throwing themselves at the concrete. Then, I heard it. Clang! It was faint, muffled by 180 feet of distance and the wind, but it was distinct. Metal on metal. Clang! 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 They were hitting the fire escape. I ran to the steel door I had screwed shut. I pressed my ear against the cold metal skin. The vibration was there, a low-frequency thrumming traveling up the galvanized spine of the staircase. They were climbing. I checked the screws. 6 tech screws, number 12 gauge, driven through the frame. They were tough, but they were designed for sheer strength, not tension. If enough weight pressed from the outside, the threads would strip. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked clouds in the flashlight beam. I needed intel. I needed to know if the military was coming, if this was an extraction or a containment. I grabbed the handheld radio. I twisted the volume knob. Nothing.
The small LCD screen was blank. The battery, which had been sitting in the charging cradle, was dead. The cradle had no power. "Think," I hissed, hitting my helmet with my knuckles. "Think like a mechanic." Problem 1, the cold is returning. Problem 2, no water production. Problem 3, no intel. Problem 4, hostiles ascending. I could not solve the hostiles yet. Gravity and the door were my only defense there. I had to solve the power. If I had power, I could charge the radio. If I had the radio, I could find a frequency. If I had power, I could run a resistance heater, or at least a halogen lamp. I needed a generator. I looked around the head house. I had AC motors everywhere, 75 horsepower induction motors. You cannot make electricity with an induction motor unless you have a capacitor bank and a prime mover spinning it at supersynchronous speed. I did not have that. I needed a DC motor, a permanent magnet DC motor. If you spin a PMDC motor, it pushes voltage out. The scrap pile. I scrambled over to the corner where the maintenance crew threw the dead parts. Rusted sheaves, cut belts, bent conduit.
I dug through the pile, tossing metal aside. The noise was too loud in the silent room, but I did not care. Clang! Clang! The sound on the stairs was getting louder. They were passing the halfway point. The acoustic rhythm was changing, less of a distant gong, more of a sharp rattle. My hand closed around a heavy, finned casing. A cooling fan. Specifically, a cabinet cooling fan from an old variable frequency drive, VFD cabinet. I pulled it out. It was a heavy-duty industrial fan, roughly 10 inches in diameter. I spun the blades with my finger. It offered resistance, the magnetic cogging of a permanent magnet motor. Yes. I flipped it over. The nameplate was scratched but readable. 24 VDC, 3.5 amp. If I spun this, I could generate voltage. Maybe not 24 volts, but enough to wake up a 7.4 V radio battery. But what would spin it? The wind. Outside, the prairie wind was screaming, gusting to 40 miles per hour. It was hitting the head house with enough force to flex the siding. I needed a turbine. I looked at the fan blades. They were small, designed to push air, not catch it. They would not generate enough torque. I needed surface area. I scanned the room. PVC pipe? No. Sheet metal? The conduit pile. There was a stack of 4-inch PVC conduit scraps. I grabbed a 2-foot section of PVC. I pulled my Kershaw knife. The plastic was frozen and brittle. I sawed the pipe in half lengthwise, creating 2 C-shaped troughs. Then I cut those in half. 4 blades. I needed to attach them to the fan hub. I grabbed the drill. Battery, 1 bar. I had to make this count. I drilled holes in the center of the PVC strips. I drilled matching pilot holes into the plastic blades of the cooling fan. I ran tech screws through the PVC and into the fan blades, creating a crude 4-arm vertical axis turbine. It looked like a kinetic sculpture made of garbage, but it was light. Bang! The sound came from the door. Not a vibration, an impact. I spun around, aiming the flashlight. The door jumped in its frame. The crash bar rattled. They were at the top. I rushed to the door, the impact driver in my hand. I watched the seam where the door met the jamb. The paint was cracking. The steel skin was flexing outward. "Hey!" I shouted, a stupid, reflexive animal noise. The banging stopped for a second. Then it redoubled. A cacophony of fists, or heads, or bodies slamming against the steel. The screws held, but I saw the head of the top screw turn a fraction of a degree.
It was backing out. I could not reinforce it. I had no lumber to bar it. I had to trust the fasteners. I turned back to my generator. Survival was a sequence of tasks. Task 1, secure door. Done to best of ability. Task 2, power. I stripped the wires on the cooling fan, red and black. I grabbed a length of 14-gauge THHN wire from a spool. I used wire nuts to splice an extension cord to the fan lead.
Now, I had to mount it outside. The only way out was the fire escape, which was occupied, or the roof hatch. The roof hatch was a small maintenance square in the ceiling, 20 feet up. Access was via a vertical ladder welded to the wall. I grabbed the fan assembly, the wire, and a roll of duct tape. I shoved the impact driver into my pocket. I climbed the ladder. The rungs were ice cold, sucking the heat from my gloves. I reached the hatch. It was held by a simple latch. I pushed. The wind caught the lid and ripped it from my grip, slamming it back against the roof decking with a crash that shook the ladder. The hole above me was a square of violent, swirling snow. I climbed out. The roof of the head house was a terrifying place. It was pitched metal, slick with frost, 190 feet in the air. The wind hit me like a physical tackle, nearly blowing me off the ladder. I hooked my arm through the rungs, gasping. The noise was deafening. The wind roared like a jet engine. Below, the fires of the train wreck illuminated the swirling snow in hellish flashes of orange. I crawled. I stayed on my belly, shuffling toward the roof vent pipe, a sturdy, galvanized steel chimney about 3 feet tall. My fingers were numb. I could not feel the tape roll. I had to use my eyes to confirm my grip. I reached the vent pipe. I wrestled the fan turbine into position. I placed it on top of the pipe, using the vertical vent as a mast. I wrapped the duct tape around the base of the fan housing, securing it to the pipe. Round and round. I used the whole roll. It had to hold against a gale. The wind caught the PVC blades. Whirr. It spun. It caught a gust and accelerated. The crude blades blurred. The fan motor whined, a rising pitch that harmonized with the gale. It was working. I grabbed the wire trailing from the motor and fed it down through the open hatch. I scrambled back to the hole, swinging my legs into the void, finding the ladder rungs with my boots. I pulled the hatch shut above me, fighting the wind until the latch clicked. I slid down the ladder, hitting the concrete floor hard. The room was still dark, but the wire dangling from the ceiling was my lifeline. I stripped the ends of the extension cord. I grabbed the radio charging cradle. I did not have the time or tools to build a proper voltage regulator. I was going to raw dog it. I looked at the back of the cradle. Input, 12 volts DC. The turbine was spinning fast, probably putting out 30 volts in the gusts. It might fry the circuit. I needed a resistor, something to burn off the excess voltage. The light bulb. The 120-volt incandescent bulb in the break room. I wired the bulb in series with the charger. It would act as a crude current limiter. I twisted the wires together. Generator positive to bulb, bulb to charger positive, generator negative to charger negative. I watched the bulb. It flickered. A dim, pulsing red glow. The filament was barely lighting up, absorbing the voltage spike. I looked at the charging cradle. The tiny LED on the front blinked. Green, off. Green, off. Power. I jammed the radio battery into the slot. The light turned solid red. Charging. Come on, I whispered. Give me 5 minutes. Crack. The sound was like a gunshot. I spun toward the fire door. The top hinge had failed.
The weld had snapped. The door was hanging crooked, a gap of daylight, no, moonlight, visible at the top corner. Through the gap, I saw fingers. Gray, bloody fingers curling around the steel frame, pulling. They were not just banging anymore. They were dismantling the barrier. I grabbed the impact driver. I needed to block that gap. I looked for material. The steel spout liners were on the trap door. I could not move them. That would open the floor. The electrical cabinet doors. I ran to the MCC. I used the impact driver to back out the hinge screws on the panel door for Silo 4 conveyor. The sheet metal door fell into my hands. 4 feet tall, 2 feet wide. Heavy gauge. I ran to the fire door. The fingers were clawing at the insulation. A face appeared in the gap, a ruin of a face. Jaw slack, eyes milky and wide. It hissed, a sound like a leaking tire. I did not hesitate. I slammed the electrical panel door over the gap.
I pressed my shoulder against it, feeling the weight of the bodies on the other side pushing back. It was a contest of leverage. I raised the impact driver. I had to drive a screw through the panel, through the gap, and into the exterior steel frame. I pulled the trigger. Whir, clack, clack, clack. The screw bit. Metal shrieked. The head stripped, but it held. I drove another, and another. I was sewing the wound shut. The pushing from the outside intensified. The door groaned. The remaining tech screws in the main door were pinging. The steel stretched to its yield limit. Hold, I gritted out, bracing my boot against a floor conduit for leverage. I fired the last screw into the bottom corner of the patch. The door held. The gap was gone. The hissing was muffled again. I slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor. My arms were shaking so badly I dropped the drill. I looked at the radio charger. The light was still solid red. I crawled over to it. I pulled the battery out. It had been charging for maybe 10 minutes. It was not full, but it was not dead. I slapped the battery into the back of the handheld radio. I turned the knob. The screen lit up. Channel 1. Static. I hit the scan button. Crackle. To any survivors in the sector, this is the National Guard Engineering Corps. We have established a hard perimeter at the I-70 overpass. The voice was clear, methodical. The rail line is compromised. Do not attempt to reach the rail yard. I repeat, the rail yard is a kill box. All refugees are advised to seek altitude. The threat is struggling with vertical navigation on complex structures. If you are elevated, stay put. We are commencing a thermobaric sanitation of the low ground at 0600 hours. Sanitation. I looked at my watch. 4:30. They were going to burn the rail yard. I was directly above the rail yard. Thermobaric, I whispered. Fuel-air explosives. They were going to drop a bomb that ignited the atmosphere. The grain dust. If they detonated a fuel-air bomb down there, and the shockwave hit the elevator, the suspended dust in the silos would ignite. The entire structure would become the world's largest pipe bomb. I was not safe. I was sitting on top of a 180-foot stick of dynamite, and the military was about to light the fuse. I keyed the mic. This is... I stopped. Who was I? This is the coop elevator. I am in the head house. Do not fire. I repeat, do not fire near the silos. We are full. You'll take out the interstate bridge if this thing blows. I released the button. Silence. Then,
Station calling. Identify. You are in the blast zone. I'm the millwright, I said. I'm securing the facility. But you cannot bomb the yard. The dust concentration is critical. If you hit it, the overpressure will level a 3-mile radius. A pause. A long pause. Copy, millwright.
We are reading thermal signatures on the structure. You have hostiles at the base.
I know, I said, looking at the bulging door. I'm handling it.
If we abort the strike, you are on your own. We cannot extract you. The ground is lost.
I do not need extraction, I lied. My voice sounded surprisingly steady. I need you to not blow me up.
Understood. We are shifting coordinates to the west. Good luck, millwright.
Out. The radio clicked off. I sat in the dark. The wind turbine was still humming above, a jagged, uneven rhythm. The red light on the charger glowed like a single, angry eye. I had stopped the bomb. But I had not stopped the cold. And I had not stopped the things scratching at the door. I looked at the temperature gauge on the multimeter, which was now flickering as the turbine surged. 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The grain pile in the corner was waiting. I crawled into the wheat. I pulled the canvas tarp over my head. I clutched the radio to my chest. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a hollow ache in my bones. I listened to the scratching on the door. It was rhythmic now. Tireless. They were not going away. I was the captain of a concrete ship sailing through a sea of the dead, powered by a fan blade and a prayer. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I had to figure out how to kill them without opening the door. Tomorrow, if the door held. I fell asleep to the sound of the screw threads groaning under the strain.
Time dissolved. The first week was a blur of adrenaline and shivering. The second week was a rhythmic misery. By the third week, the calendar on the wall ceased to be a record of days and became a maintenance log of my own decay. Day 21. I woke up before the sun. My internal clock had synchronized with the thermal cycle of the head house. The coldest hour was 4 a.m., and the drop in temperature always woke me. I rolled out of the wheat nest. The grain had compacted under my weight, forming a semi-rigid mold of my body. It smelled of fermentation now, yeast and damp earth. My body heat, trapped under the tarp, was causing the wheat to sweat. I stood up, wrapping the canvas tarp around my shoulders like a monk's robe. My breath plumed in the air. 28 degrees Fahrenheit inside. I walked the perimeter. This was the liturgy. First, the door. I shined the streamlight, now powered by a rechargeable battery I swapped daily with the radio, on the patch. The electrical panel I had screwed over the gap was holding. The scratching had stopped 3 days ago. The hostiles had either frozen solid or lost interest. I did not open it to check. The silence was enough. Second, the trapdoor. The steel plates were undisturbed. I knelt and put my ear to the floor. The wind whistling up the manlift shaft sounded different, hollower. The grain levels in the silos below were dropping as the rats ate their way through the hoppers, or maybe the hopper doors had failed. It did not matter. The shaft was a chimney, and I was the damper. Third, the systems. I checked the power plant. The PVC wind turbine was still spinning, though the bearings on the cooling fan were starting to scream. A high-pitched squeal that cut through the wind. I'd have to grease it soon. I'd have to climb out there again. The thought made my stomach turn, but I pushed it down. Maintenance is mandatory. I checked the water refinery. The halogen lamp was dead. The bulb had burned out on day 8.
I had replaced it with a resistance heater made from a coil of nichrome wire I'd scavenged from a space heater in the break room, wrapped around a ceramic insulator. It was dangerous, exposed live wire, but it worked. It ran directly off the wind turbine. When the wind blew hard, the coil glowed cherry red and the snow melted fast. When the wind died, the coil went dark, and I chewed ice. Today, the wind was good. The coil was dull orange. The aluminum can was simmering. I poured the water through the filter. The N95 mask was black with carbon dust. I was drinking grit, but I was not sick. That was the only metric that mattered. I sat at the break room table. My breakfast was a handful of raw wheat berries from my bedding. I chewed them slowly. They were hard as rocks. You had to let them soften in your saliva for 10 minutes before biting down, or you'd crack a tooth. I had lost weight.
I could feel my ribs against the inside of my coveralls. My hands were stained permanently black with grease and soot. My fingernails were cracked. I turned on the radio. Channel 1. Static. Channel 3. National Guard. Static. They had moved on. The sanitation had pushed the front line west, toward Denver. I was in the rear-view mirror, a ghost in a tower. I walked to the south window. The snow covered everything now. The train wreck was a series of white mounds, smoothed by the drifts. The blackened scars of the fires were gone. The cars on the highway were white humps. I looked down at the fire escape landing. I could see them now. 3 of them. Frozen. They were huddled against the railing, encased in ice. They looked like statues. One was reaching for the door, its arm extended, fingers splayed. The frost had preserved them perfectly. I did not feel fear. I did not feel anger. I felt a professional detachment. They were failed components, decommissioned units. I picked up the binoculars found in the bottom of a tool locker on day 12. I scanned the horizon. Movement. 3 miles out, near the creek bed. A herd of deer. They were moving north, stepping high through the snow. And behind them, a pack of dogs. Not wild dogs, domestic dogs, labs, shepherds, running in a pack. They were not playing. They were hunting. Nature was resetting. The infrastructure was dead, but the biology was adapting fast. I lowered the binoculars. I had a choice. I could stay here. I had water, as long as it snowed. I had food, thousands of bushels of raw wheat, if I could stomach it. I had heat, as long as the wind blew. But the bearings on the turbine would fail. The wheat would run out or mold. The mental isolation would eventually crack the hull of my sanity. Or I could descend. I looked at the map on the wall, a faded promotional calendar for a pesticide company. It showed the rail lines. The track ran west, toward the mountains. The radio said the perimeter was at the overpass, but that was weeks ago. They might be in Colorado by now. I looked at my welding rig in the corner. I had built a sled. It was made from a section of conveyor belting and bent conduit. I had packed it. The impact driver, 2 batteries, the solar panel I had ripped off the roof of the scale house using a grapple hook and a winch I rigged through the floor hatch. That was a good day. Day 15. 10 pounds of wheat in a sealed bag. The water bottles. The pry bar. I was not a survivor. I was a technician. And a technician knows when a machine has reached the end of its service life. The elevator was dying. The concrete was spalling. The vibration from the wind was loosening the bolts on the siding. It was time to decommission the site. I walked to the electrical room. I looked at the date on the wall. December 25th. Christmas. I laughed. A dry, rasping sound. I took the Sharpie. Status: Site abandoned. Millwright Mobile, heading west. I put the cap on the marker. I walked to the trap door. I removed the steel plates. I looked down the shaft. It was pitch black. I grabbed the manlift belt. It was frozen stiff. I would have to climb the ladder, 180 feet down into the dark. I clipped the radio to my chest. I strapped the tool bag to my waist. I pulled the sled harness over my shoulders. I took one last look at the head house, the nest of wheat, the glowing coil of wire, the wind turbine spinning overhead. I had built a life here, a small, ugly, functional life. "Lock it out," I whispered. I turned off the breaker to the wind turbine heater. The coil faded to gray. I stepped onto the ladder and began the descent. The wind howled around the concrete tube, a mournful song for the end of the world. But I was not listening to the wind anymore. I was listening to the sound of my boots on the rungs. Clank, clank, clank. Solid, rhythmic. I was moving. And as long as I was moving, I was working. The ladder shaft was a vertical coffin. I had descended 60 feet when the darkness became absolute. The faint light from the headhouse hatch above was blocked by the safety cage and my own body. Below, the pit was a black void that smelled of wet concrete and sour mash. Climbing down is biomechanically harder than climbing up. Your quadriceps act as brakes, absorbing the impact of every step. With the sled hanging from my harness, swaying like a pendulum, the rhythm was jerky and exhausting. Step, lock knee, lower. Step. I counted the rungs. 180 feet meant roughly 180 rungs. I was at 80. At rung 120, the temperature shifted. The biting wind of the summit vanished, replaced by a stagnant, heavy dampness. This was the stack effect in reverse. The cold air was sinking, pooling at the bottom of the silo complex, carrying the dust and the smell of the dead with it. I stopped at the landing platform just above the boot pit. My legs were trembling, the lactic acid burn flaring in my thighs. I clicked on the streamlight, shielding the lens with my gloved fingers to minimize the spill. The beam cut through the gloom. I was standing on the grate above the bucket elevator boot, the pulley system where the grain is scooped up. The pit was flooded, not with water, but with wheat. The boot housing had ruptured during the catastrophe, spilling thousands of bushels into the maintenance tunnel. The golden grain was piled 6 feet deep, burying the lower walkway. And the rats were there. They were not scurrying. They were sluggish, bloated things, moving slowly through the grain like swimmers in molasses. They did not look at the light. They were busy. I did not look at what they were eating. I knew Jim's body had not been on the gravel outside. I traversed the grate, stepping carefully over the missing section where the maintenance hoist used to be. The exit door, a heavy steel man door leading to the parking lot, was 10 feet away. I reached the door. It was frozen shut. Condensation had run down the steel frame and pooled at the threshold, welding the bottom of the door to the concrete with a thick band of ice. I unclipped the pry bar from the sled. Noise discipline was about to be broken. There was no quiet way to break ice. I jammed the chisel tip of the bar into the ice near the hinge side. I hammered the end of the bar with the heel of my hand. Thwack! A shard of ice skittered across the floor. I worked the perimeter, chipping away the seal. It took 10 minutes of sweating, silent labor. When the visible ice was gone,
I wedged the bar into the jamb and leaned my weight into it. The door groaned. The rust seal fought the leverage. "Open," I whispered, putting my boot against the frame and heaving. With a screech of tearing metal and shattering ice, the door popped open. The light blinded me. It was not sunny. The sky was a flat, slate gray, but the reflection off the snow was intense after 40 days in the dark. I blinked, tears streaming down my face, and raised the pry bar defensively. The parking lot was a white wasteland. The wind had sculpted the snow into dunes that buried the fence line.
The train wreck was a series of white hummocks to my left. The scale house was a ruin, its windows blown out, filled with drifts. I scanned for movement. Nothing moved. The temperature was 0 or close to it. Biology stops at 0. I stepped out, the snow crunching loudly under my boots. I moved toward the maintenance shed where I had parked the Silverado. I found it. It was a white mound with a singular antenna poking out. I approached the driver's side. I brushed the snow off the window. Inside, the cab was a time capsule. A grandiose coffee cup sat in the cup holder. My sunglasses were on the dash. It looked peaceful. It was also a 2-ton brick of frozen steel. I cleared the snow from the grill. I needed to get under the hood. I pulled the release lever inside the cab, which felt stiff and terrified me, thinking the cable might snap, but the hood popped. I lifted the heavy steel hood. The engine bay was packed with wind-blown snow. The 6.6-liter Duramax diesel engine sat there, silent and cold. Diesel engines rely on compression to ignite fuel. Cold air does not compress well. Cold oil turns to tar. Cold batteries lose their chemical reaction potential. I checked the dipstick. I pulled it out. The oil did not drip. It hung there, thick and black, the consistency of warm asphalt. 15W40 oil flows at 0 degrees, but barely. I checked the fuel filter primer. I pushed the plunger. It was rock hard. The fuel had gelled. The paraffin wax in the diesel had crystallized, clogging the filter and the lines. Even if the engine turned over, it would starve in seconds. I needed heat, and I needed electricity. I walked to the bed of the truck. The welding rig, a Lincoln Ranger 305, was bolted to the bed. It was a gasoline engine. Gas does not gel like diesel, but it degrades. I cleared the snow off the welder. I checked the gas tank. Half full. I smelled the cap. It smelled like varnish, but it still had the sharp tang of volatiles. I opened the side panel of the welder. It had its own battery, a small 12-volt lawn tractor-style battery. I pulled my multimeter from the tool bag. I touched the probes to the welder battery terminals. 10. 2 volts. Dead. Not stone dead, but too weak to crank the coal generator engine. I checked the truck's dual batteries. 11. 1 volts. Better. But 2 weak batteries do not make a strong one. They make a disappointment. I had to play a game of electrical chess. I needed to start the welder. The welder had a 10,000-watt generator. If I could start the welder, I could plug in the truck's block heater. The block heater would warm the oil and the coolant. Warm cylinders fire. But I could not start the welder with a dead battery. The solar panel. I had the small solar panel strapped to my sled. It was a 50-watt trickle charger. I set the panel on the roof of the truck, angling it south. I wired it directly to the welder's battery. I looked at the sky. It was overcast. The panel was putting out maybe 0.5 amps. It would take hours. I did not have hours. The sun was already past its zenith. If I was here at nightfall, the cold would kill me, or the things that froze at night would wake up. I needed a surge. I looked at the truck batteries again. They had 11 volts. That was enough to turn the small gas engine of the welder, but not the massive diesel truck engine. I dug through my toolboxes in the truck bed. I found my jumper cables, heavy gauge, 00 welding cable I had made myself. I connected the truck's driver's side battery to the welder's starter solenoid. I was robbing Peter to pay Paul. If this failed, I drained the truck batteries and killed my only exit strategy. I poured a cap full of gasoline directly into the welder's carburetor throat. I choked the welder. I held the jumper cables tight. "Turn," I commanded. I hit the start switch on the welder. Rrrr, rrrr. Sluggish. The cold oil in the small Kohler engine fought the pistons. Rrrr. Pop, the gas ignited. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Again. Rrrr. Vroom, the welder roared to life. It settled into a high idle, a loud, mechanical scream that shattered the silence of the prairie. I winced. That sound would travel for miles. I did not have time to worry about it. I flipped the output switch to AC run start. I grabbed the heavy orange extension cord from the bed. I plugged it into the 240-volt outlet on the welder. I ran the cord to the front of the truck and plugged in the block heater. I heard the faint hiss of the heating element engaging inside the engine block. Now, the fuel. The block heater would not fix the gelled fuel in the tank or the filter. I opened the side toolbox of the truck, my chemical warfare drawer. I found the white bottle. Power Service Diesel 911. The red lettering promised to de-gel frozen fuel systems. I opened the truck's fuel filter housing. I poured the red solvent directly into the filter bowl, filling it to the brim. This was a hot shot. I dumped the rest of the bottle into the fuel tank. Now, the waiting game. I sat in the cab of the truck, the welder roaring in the bed behind me. I watched the perimeter. 10 minutes. I saw movement near the train wreck. A dark shape detached itself from the shadows of a boxcar. It moved slowly, stiffly. The noise was waking them up. 15 minutes. 2 more shapes appeared near the scale house. They were shambling toward the sound. They were slow. The cold made their muscles rigid, but they were relentless. I checked the temp gauge on the dashboard. The needle had not moved, but the windshield was starting to defrost near the vents. The block was warming. I could not wait any longer. I killed the welder. The silence rushed back in, ringing in my ears. I turned the key in the ignition to the on position. The glow plug light illuminated. I waited. The truck computer was checking the ambient temperature and heating the cylinders. The light stayed on for a long time. Click. The light went out. I turned the key. The engine turned over slowly, heavy, reluctant. Clack. Come on, you pig, I gritted out. Vroom! Clack, clack, clack. The diesel caught. It sounded terrible, like a bucket of bolts being shaken in a dryer. The idle was rough, hunting up and down as the engine chewed through the gelled fuel and the 911 solvent. Thick white smoke poured out of the exhaust pipe, blinding me in the side mirror. I slammed the truck into drive. Nothing happened. The transmission fluid was cold. I revved the engine. The RPMs climbed to 2,000. Thunk. The transmission engaged. I hit the gas.
The tires spun on the ice, then bit into the gravel. The Silverado surged forward, smashing through the snowdrift at the gate. I looked in the rearview mirror. The figures from the train wreck were converging on the spot where I had been parked. One of them, a figure in a torn conductor's uniform, threw itself at the space where the truck had been, clawing at the empty air. I did not look back again. I hit the frontage road. The suspension was frozen solid. Every pothole felt like a frame-shattering impact. The steering was stiff. The engine was complaining, but I was moving.
I turned west, toward the setting sun and the mountains. The grain elevator rose in the mirror, a gray tombstone against the sky. I saw the PVC turbine on the roof, a tiny speck, still spinning in the wind. I tapped the dashboard. "Good girl," I whispered to the machine. The heater blew a faint wisp of warm air against my frozen knuckles. I drove toward the horizon, leaving the silo architect behind. Now, I was just a traveler on a dead highway.